Chapter 10. Our Empire Style. We went to Hitler's evenings once or twice a week. Around midnight, after the last movie had been run, he sometimes asked to see my roll of drawings and studied every detail until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The other guests withdrew for a glass of wine or went home, aware that there would be little chance to have a word with Hitler once he was caught up in his ruling passion. Hitler's favourite project was our model city, which was set up in the former exhibition rooms of the Berlin Academy of Arts. In order to reach it undisturbed, he had doors installed in the walls between the Chancellery and our building, and a communicating path laid out. Sometimes he invited the supper guests to our studio. We would set out armed with flashlights and keys. In the empty halls, spotlights illuminated the models. There was no need for me to do the talking, for Hitler, with flashing eyes, explained every single detail to his companions. There was keen excitement when a new model was set up and illuminated by brilliant spots from the direction in which the sun would fall on the actual buildings. Most of these models were made on a scale of 1 to 50. Cabinet makers reproduced every small detail, and the wood was painted to simulate the materials that would actually be used. In this way, whole sections of the grand new avenue were gradually put together, and we could have a three-dimensional impression of the building intended to be a reality in a decade. This model street went on for about 100 feet through the former exhibition rooms of the Academy of Arts. Hitler was particularly excited over a large model of the Grand Boulevard on a scale of 1 to 1,000. He loved to enter his avenue at various points and take measure of the future effect. For example, he assumed the point of view of a traveller emerging from the South Station, or admired the Great Hall as it looked from the heart of the avenue. To do so, he bent down, almost kneeling, his eye an inch or so above the level of the model, in order to have the right perspective, and while looking he spoke with unusual vivacity. These were the rare times when he relinquished his usual stiffness. In no other situation did I see him so lively, so spontaneous, so relaxed, whereas I myself, often tired, and even after years never free of a trace of respectful constraint, usually remained taciturn. One of my close associates summed up the character of this remarkable relationship. Do you know what you are? You are Hitler's unrequited love. These rooms were kept under careful guard, and no one was allowed to inspect the grand plan for the rebuilding of Berlin without Hitler's express permission. Once, when Goering had examined the model of the Grand Boulevard, he had his escort walk on ahead, then said in a deeply moved tone, "A few days ago the Führer spoke to me about my mission after his death. He leaves me free to handle everything as I think best. But he made me promise one thing, that I would never replace you by anyone else after his death, that I would not tamper with your plans, but let you take complete charge, and that I must place the money for the buildings at your disposal, all the money you ask for." Goering made an emotional pause. I solemnly took the Führer's hand and promised him that, and I now make the same promise to you. Whereupon he gave me a long and sentimental handshake. My father too came to see the work of his now famous son. He only shrugged his shoulders at the array of models. "You've all gone completely crazy." The evening of his visit, we went to the theatre and saw a comedy in which Heinz Rühmann was appearing. By chance, Hitler was at the same performance. During the intermission, he sent one of his adjutants to ask whether the old gentleman sitting beside me was my father. Then he asked us both to his box. When my father, still erect and self-controlled in spite of his 75 years, was introduced to Hitler, he was overcome by a violent quivering such as I had never seen him exhibit before, nor ever did again. He turned pale, did not respond to Hitler's lavish praise of his son, and then took his leave in silence. Later my father never mentioned this meeting, and I too avoided asking him about the fit of nerves that the sight of Hitler had produced in him. You've all gone completely crazy. And nowadays, when I leaf through the numerous photos of models of our one-time Grand Boulevard, I see that it would have turned out not only crazy, but also boring. We had, of course, recognized that lining the new avenue solely with public buildings would lead to a certain lifelessness, and had therefore reserved 2/3 of the length of the street for private buildings. With Hitler's support, we fended off efforts by various government agencies to displace these business buildings. We had no wish for an avenue consisting solely of ministries, a luxurious movie house for premieres, another cinema for the masses accommodating 2,000 persons, a new opera house, 3 theatres, a new concert hall, a building for Congress, the so-called House of the Nations, a hotel of 21 stories, variety theatres, mass and luxury restaurants, and even an indoor swimming pool built in Roman style and as large as the baths of Imperial Rome were deliberately included in the plans with the idea of bringing urban life into the new avenue. There were to be quiet interior courtyards with colonnades and small luxury shops set apart from the noise of the street and inviting strollers. Electric signs were to be employed profusely. The whole avenue was also conceived by Hitler and me as a continuous sales display of German goods, which would exert a special attraction upon foreigners. Whenever nowadays I look through the plans and the photos of the models, even these varied parts of the avenue strike me as lifeless and regimented. When on the morning after my release from imprisonment I passed one of these buildings on the way to the airport, I saw in a few seconds what I had been blind to for years. Our plan completely lacked a sense of proportion. We had set aside block units of between 500 feet and 660 feet, even for private businesses. A uniform height had been imposed on all the buildings as well as on all the store fronts. Skyscrapers, however, were banished from the foreground. Thus we deprived ourselves of all the contrasts essential for animating and loosening the pattern. The entire conception was stamped by a monumental rigidity that would have counteracted all our efforts to introduce urban life into this avenue. Our happiest concept, comparatively speaking, was the Central Railroad Station, the southern pole of Hitler's Grand Boulevard. The station, its steel ribbing showing through sheathings of copper and glass, would have handsomely offset the great blocks of stone dominating the rest of the avenue. It provided for 4 traffic levels linked by escalators and elevators and was to surpass New York's Grand Central Station in size. State visitors would have descended a large outside staircase. The idea was that as soon as they, as well as ordinary travellers, stepped out of the station, they would be overwhelmed, or rather stunned, by the urban scene and thus the power of the Reich. The station plaza, 3,300 feet long and 1,000 feet wide, was to be linked with captured weapons after the fashion of the Avenue of Rams, which leads from Karnak to Luxor. Hitler conceived this detail after the campaign in France and came back to it again in the late autumn of 1941 after his first defeats in the Soviet Union. This plaza was to be crowned by Hitler's Great Arch, or Arch of Triumph, as he only occasionally called it. Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe de Place de l'Étoile, with its 160-foot height, certainly presents a monumental appearance, and provides a majestic terminus to the Champs-Élysées. Our Triumphal Arch, 550 feet wide, 392 feet deep, and 386 feet high, would have towered over all the other buildings on this southern portion of the avenue, and would literally have dwarfed them. After trying a few times in vain, I no longer had the courage to urge any changes on Hitler. This was the heart of his plan. He had conceived it long before encountering the purifying influence of Professor Troost, and the arch was the classic example of the architectural fantasies he had worked out in his lost sketchbook of the 20s. He remained impervious to all my hints that the monument might be improved by a change of proportions or a simplification of lines, and did not demur when on the plans I delicately indicated the architect by 3 X's. Everyone would know who the anonymous architect was. Sighting through the 260-foot opening of the Great Arch, the arriving traveller would see at the end of a 3-mile vista the street's second great triumphal structure rearing out of the haze of the metropolis. The Great Hall with its enormous dome, described in an earlier chapter. 11 separate ministry buildings adorned the avenue between the Triumphal Arch and the Great Hall. I had already designed quarters for the ministries of the interior, transportation, justice, economics and food when, after 1941, I was told to include a colonial ministry in my plans. In other words, even after the invasion of Russia, Hitler was dreaming of acquiring German colonies. The ministers, who hoped that our program would result in concentration of their offices, now distributed throughout Berlin, were disappointed. For by Hitler's decree, the new buildings were to serve chiefly for purposes of prestige, not for the housing of the bureaucratic apparatus. After the monumental central section, the avenue once more resumed its business and entertainment character for a distance of more than half a mile, and ended with the round plaza at the intersection with Potsdamer Straße. Proceeding northward, it once more began to be ceremonial. On the right rose Soldiers' Hall, designed by Wilhelm Kreis, a huge cube whose purpose Hitler had never stated frankly, but was probably to be a combination of armory and veterans' memorial. At any rate, after the armistice with France, he gave orders that the dining car, in which the surrender of Germany had been signed in 1918 and the surrender of France in 1940, was to be brought here as the hall's first exhibit. A crypt was planned for the tombs of celebrated German field marshals of the past, present and future. Stretching westward behind the hall as far as Bendlerstrasse were to be the buildings for a new high command of the army. After inspecting these plans, Goering felt that his air ministry had been demoted. He asked me to be his architect. Despite my official position as General Inspector of Buildings, Hitler allowed me to design major buildings as a private architect. The general procedure for the reconstruction of Berlin was to call in private architects to design the official buildings as well as the commercial buildings. Opposite the Soldiers' Hall, on the edge of the Tiergarten, we found an ideal building for his purposes. Goering was enraptured by my plans for his new building, which after 1940 went by the name of Office of the Reich Marshal, in order to do justice to the multitude of positions he held. But Hitler was less so. "The building is too big for Goering," he commented. "He's puffing himself up too much. All in all, I don't like his taking my architect for that purpose." Although he privately grumbled a good deal over Goering's plans, he never found the courage to speak out on the matter. Goering knew Hitler and reassured me. "Just let the matter be and don't worry about it. We'll build it that way, and in the end the Führer will be delighted." Hitler often showed similar forbearance in personal matters. Thus he overlooked the marital misdemeanours of his entourage, unless, as in the Blomberg case, the scandal could be made to serve a political purpose. He could also smile at someone's craving for pomp and make acid remarks in private without so much as hinting to the person concerned that he disapproved of his conduct. The design for Goering's headquarters provided for extensive series of stairways, halls and salons which took up more room than the offices themselves. The heart of the building was to be an imposing hall with a great flight of stairs rising through 4 stories, which would never have been used since everyone would of course have taken the elevator. The whole thing was pure spectacle. This was a decisive step in my personal development from the neoclassicism I had first espoused, and which was perhaps still to be seen in the new chancellery, to a blatant nouveau riche architecture of prestige. An entry for May the 5th, 1941, in my office journal records that the Reich Marshal was highly pleased with the model of his building. The staircase especially delighted him. Here he would stand, he declared, when he proclaimed the watchword of the year for the officers of the Air Force. The office journal preserves more of his magniloquence. "In tribute to this, the greatest staircase in the world," Goering continued, "Brecker must create a monument to the Inspector General of Buildings. It will be installed here to commemorate forever the man who so magnificently shaped this building." This part of the ministry, with its 800 feet of frontage on the Grand Boulevard, was supplemented by a wing of equal size on the Tiergarten side, which contained the ballrooms Goering had stipulated as well as his private apartment. I situated the bedrooms on the top story. Alleging the need for air raid protection, I decided to cover the roof with 13 feet of garden soil, which meant that even large trees would have been able to strike root there. Thus I envisioned a 2.5-acre roof garden with swimming pools and tennis courts, fountains, ponds, colonnades, pergolas and refreshment rooms, and finally a summer theatre for 240 spectators above the roofs of Berlin. Goering was overwhelmed and began raving about the parties he would hold there. "I'll illuminate the great dome with Bengal lights and provide grand fireworks for my guests." Without the basements, Goering's buildings would have had a volume of 754,000 cubic yards. The volume of Hitler's newly built chancellery was only 520,000 cubic yards. Nevertheless, Hitler did not feel that Goering had outstripped him. In that speech of August the 1st, 1938, in which he disclosed so many of his theories on architecture, Hitler let it be known that according to the great plan for the rebuilding of Berlin, the newly completed Chancellery would be used for 10 or 12 years. The plan, he said, provided for a residence and seat of government many times larger. After an inspection of Hesse's party headquarters in Berlin, Hitler had abruptly decided on the final destiny of the Vossstrasse Chancellery. At Hesse's headquarters, Hitler was unpleasantly impressed by a stairwell painted a fiery red, and furnishings that were considerably plainer and more austere than the ocean liner style he and the other party and government leaders inclined toward. Back at the Chancellery, Hitler criticized his deputy's taste in no uncertain terms. Hess is totally unartistic. I must never let him build anything new. After a while he'll receive the present Chancellery as his headquarters, and he won't be allowed to make the slightest changes in it, because he's completely ignorant on such matters. This kind of criticism, especially of a man's aesthetic judgment, could sometimes spell an end to a career, and in the case of Rudolf Hess it was generally so taken. But Hitler never said a word of this to Hess. Hess could only observe that his standing must have fallen by the courtier's reserved attitude toward him thereafter. There was to be a huge railroad station to the north as well as to the south of the city. Emerging from it, the visitor would face a basin of water 3,300 feet long and 1,150 feet wide, across which the Great Dome was to be seen a mile away. We did not intend to take our water from the Spree, polluted as it was by the filth of the city. As a lover of water sports, I wanted this artificial lake to be clean enough for swimming. Dressing cabins, boathouses and refreshment terraces were to line this vast open-air pool in the heart of the city. Presumably it would have presented a remarkable contrast to the massive buildings that were to be reflected in the lake. The reason for my lake was very simple. The marshy subsoil made the land unfit for building purposes. 3 enormous buildings were to stand on the western side of the lake. In the middle would be the New Berlin Town Hall, some 1,500 feet in length. Hitler and I favoured different designs. After many discussions, my arguments prevailed, even against Hitler's persistent opposition. The town hall was flanked by the new High Command of the Navy and the New Berlin Police Headquarters. On the eastern side of the lake, in the midst of garden areas, a new German War Academy was to be built. The plans for all these buildings were completed. This avenue between the 2 central railroad stations was meant to spell out in architecture the political, military and economic power of Germany. In the centre sat the absolute ruler of the Reich, and in his immediate proximity, as the highest expression of his power, was the great domed hall, which was to be the dominant structure of the future Berlin. At least the planning would reflect Hitler's statement: Berlin must change its face in order to adapt to its great new mission. For 5 years I lived in this world of plans, and in spite of all their defects and absurdities, I still cannot entirely tear myself away from it all. When I look deep into myself for the reasons for my present hatred of Hitler, I sometimes think that in addition to all the terrible things he perpetrated, I should perhaps include the personal disappointment his war-making brought to me. But I also realize that these plans could only have sprung from his unscrupulous game of power. Designs of such scale naturally indicate a kind of chronic megalomania, which is reason enough to dwell on these grandiose plans. Yet that broad boulevard, those new central railroad stations with their underground communications, are not so excessive by present-day standards, when skyscrapers and public buildings all over the world have reached similar proportions. Perhaps it was less their size than the way they violated the human scale that made them abnormal. The great domed hall, Hitler's future chancellery, Goering's grandiose ministry, the soldiers' hall, and the triumphal arch, I saw all these buildings with Hitler's political eyes. Once, when we were contemplating the model city, he took my arm and, with moist eyes, confided, "Now do you understand why we are building all this on such a scale? The capital of the Germanic Empire. If only my health were good." Hitler was in a hurry for work to start on the 5-mile-long core of his plan. After involved calculations, I promised him that all the buildings would be completed by 1950. This was the spring of 1939. I had imagined that in setting such an early date, based as it was on a non-stop work program, I would give him special pleasure. So I was somewhat dashed when he merely accepted this deadline. Perhaps he was thinking about his military plans, which of course made a mockery of my calculations. At other times, however, he was so intent upon finishing within the intended period, and seemed to be looking forward to 1950 with such eagerness, that if his architectural fantasies were only meant to conceal his imperialistic aims, they would have been the best of all his deceits. His frequent allusions to the political importance of this project should have alerted me to the real nature of his plans, but the way he seemed to assume that my building operations in Berlin would go forward undisturbed offset these suspicions. I was accustomed to his occasionally saying things that sounded hallucinatory. In retrospect, it is easier to find the thread between this trance-like state and the building projects. Hitler was extremely concerned that our designs should not be publicized. Only parts were made known. Since we could not work entirely in secret, too many persons were engaged on preliminary jobs. Thus we occasionally permitted glimpses of aspects of the plan that seemed innocuous, and Hitler even let me publish an article outlining the basic idea of our urban renewal. But when the cabaret humorist Werner Fink made fun of these projects, he was sent off to a concentration camp, although this may not have been his only sin. His arrest took place, incidentally, just the day before I meant to attend his show, as proof that I was not offended. Our caution extended even to details. When we were considering tearing down the tower of the Berlin Town Hall, we launched a trial balloon by having State Secretary Karl Hank insert a reader's letter in a Berlin newspaper. When angry protests from the populace poured in, I postponed the matter. Our aim in general was to spare the feelings of the public in carrying out our plans. Thus we considered, for example, what to do about charming Montbijou Palace, since a museum was planned for the site. We decided to reconstruct it in the park of Charlottenburg Palace. Even the radio tower was to be preserved for similar reasons. The Victory column, while it would break the line of our projected avenue, was also not to be raised. Hitler regarded it as a monument of German history. In fact, he was going to make the column more impressive by adding a tambour to increase its height. He drew a sketch of the improvement. The drawing had been preserved. In discussing the matter, he made fun of the thrift practiced by the state of Prussia even at the height of its triumph, pinching pennies by saving on the height of its column. I estimated the total cost of the Berlin rebuilding at between 4 and 6 billion Reichsmark, which at present-day building costs would have been between 16 and 24 billion Deutschmark. Spread over 11 years, this meant about 500 million Reichsmarks to be allocated annually to the project. This was by no means a utopian proposal, for it amounted to only 1/25 of the total volume of the German construction industry. To further reassure myself, I proposed another comparison, though a highly dubious one. I calculated what percentage of the total tax revenues of the Prussian state the notably thrifty King Frederick William I of Prussia, the father of Frederick the Great, had expended on his buildings in Berlin. It was many times our projected expenditures, which amounted to only 3% of the 15,700,000,000 Reichsmarks tax revenue. But the parallel was questionable, because the revenues of the early 18th century cannot be compared with the taxation of the present day. Professor Hetledge, my budgetary advisor, commented sardonically about our approach to the matter. For the municipality of Berlin, expenditures have to be governed by income. For us, it is the other way around. As Hitler and I saw it, our annual 500 million should not be represented as a single appropriation. Rather, it was to be divided among as many budgets as possible. Every ministry and every government office was to pay for its new quarters out of its individual budget, just as the government railroad system would pay for the modernization of its Berlin installations and the city of Berlin for streets and subways. Private industry would, of course, cover its own costs. By 1938 we had settled these details, and Hitler took some glee in the cunning of it all. Distributed this way, he commented, the cost of the whole thing won't attract attention. All that will finance ourselves will be the Great Hall and the Triumphal Arch. We'll call on the people to make contributions. In addition, the Finance Minister is to place 60 million annually at the disposal of your office. Whatever we don't use of this can be put aside for the future. By 1941, I had already accumulated 218 million marks. In 1943, the sum had meanwhile increased to 320 million. The Finance Minister proposed, and I agreed, that the account be quietly dissolved. We never said a word to Hitler about this. Finance Minister von Schwerin-Krosigk, aghast at this squandering of public funds, repeatedly made objections. Lest these disturb me, Hitler fetched up counter-arguments. If the Finance Minister could realize what a source of income to the state my buildings will be in 50 years. Remember what happened with Ludwig II. Everyone said he was mad because of the cost of his palaces. But today, most tourists go to Upper Bavaria solely to see them. The entrance fees alone have long since paid for the building costs. Don't you agree? The whole world will come to Berlin to see our buildings. All we need to do is tell the Americans how much the Great Hall cost. Maybe we'll exaggerate a bit and say 1.5 billion instead of 1 billion. Then they'll be wild to see the most expensive building in the world. Each time he sat over the plans, he was apt to repeat, "My only wish, Speer, is to live to see these buildings. In 1950, we'll organise a World's Fair. Until then, the buildings will remain empty, and then they'll serve as exhibition buildings. We'll invite the entire world." That was the way Hitler talked. It was difficult to guess his real thoughts. To console my wife, who saw the next 11 years devoted entirely to work with no prospect of any family life, I promised her a trip around the world in 1950. Hitler's idea of distributing the cost of the project over as many shoulders as possible actually worked out. For Berlin, wealthy, prospering and increasingly the centre of national authority, attracted more and more government officials. Industries responded to this by making impressive additions to their Berlin headquarters. So far there had been only one avenue which functioned as Berlin's show window, Unter den Linden. Big companies were lured to the broad new boulevard, partly in the expectation of avoiding the traffic jams of the old prestige streets, partly because building lots were relatively cheap in this still undeveloped area. At the outset of my work, I received many applications for building projects which would otherwise have been scattered at random throughout the city. Thus, soon after Hitler's accession to power, the large new building of the Reichsbank had been put up in an out-of-the-way quarter. Several blocks had been torn down to make room for it. Incidentally, one day after dinner, Himmler pointed out that the longitudinal and transverse wings had the shape of a Christian cross. This, he maintained, was obviously a veiled attempt on the part of the Catholic architect Wolff to glorify the Christian religion. Hitler knew enough about building to be merely amused by such points. Within a few months after the plans were finally drafted, and even before the shifting of the railroad tracks had been completed, the first available section of the avenue, 3/4 of a mile long, was assigned to the various builders. Applications from ministries, private companies and government departments for some of the other building sites, which would not be available for several years, increased to such an extent that all the sites along the entire 4.5 miles were taken. What is more, we had to begin allocating sites south of the South Station. With some difficulty, we restrained Dr. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, from using the enormous funds he collected from workmen's contributions to buy up 1/5 of the entire length of the boulevard for his own purposes. Even so, he obtained a block 1,000 feet in length, which he planned to make into a huge amusement area. Among the motives for this burst of building fever was, of course, the desire to curry favour with Hitler by erecting important edifices. Since the expenses for such buildings were higher than they would have been on ordinary sites, I suggested to Hitler that he commend the people who commissioned the buildings for all the additional millions they were spending. The idea appealed to him immediately. Why not have a medal for those who have rendered service to art? We'll award it very rarely, and chiefly to those who have financed a major building. A lot can be done with medals. Even the British ambassador thought, and he was not wrong, that he was ingratiating himself with Hitler when he proposed building a new embassy within the framework of the Berlin Renewal Plan. Mussolini, too, was extremely interested in the project. My idea, therefore, was to exchange the embassy, which the German government would have been glad to use for government offices, for some large site on a corner of one of Hitler's new thoroughfares. I spoke both to Goering and Ribbentrop of this plan, and asked them to let Hitler know that I contemplated it. I suggested that they might inform him, and that I meant one day to talk to him about it, and hoped it would form part of a general understanding with Germany. According to the Office Journal, August the 20th, 1941, Alfieri mentioned that the Duce takes an extraordinary interest in German architecture and has already asked him if he knows Speer. Although Hitler did not reveal the full extent of his ambitions in the realm of architecture, there was plenty of discussion about what he did make public. As a result, there was a boom in architecture. Had Hitler been interested in breeding horses, a passion for horse breeding would undoubtedly have sprung up among the leading men in the Reich. As it was, there was a veritable flood of designs with a Hitlerian cast. True, no such thing as the style of the Third Reich developed, but buildings took a definite cast, marked by certain eclectic elements. Soon this mode became almost universal, yet Hitler was by no means doctrinaire. He realized full well that an Autobahn, a restaurant, or a Hitler Youth home in the country should not look like an urban building. Nor would it ever have occurred to him to build a factory in his public display style. In fact, he could become enthusiastic over an industrial building in glass and steel. But any public building in a nation that was on the point of creating an empire must, he thought, have a particular stamp. The plans for Berlin inspired a host of designs for other urban programs. Every Gauleiter henceforth wanted to immortalize himself in his own city. Almost every one of the plans, as did my Berlin design for intersecting axes, imitated my design even to the orientation. The Berlin model had become a rigid pattern. In conferring with me over plans, Hitler perpetually drew sketches of his own. They were casually tossed off, but accurate in perspective. He drew outlines, cross-sections, and renderings to scale. An architect could not have done better. Some mornings he would show me a well-executed sketch he had prepared overnight, but most of his drawings were done in a few hasty strokes during our discussions. I kept these quick sketches of Hitler's, noting their dates and subjects, and have preserved them to this day. It is interesting that of a total of 125 such drawings, a good fourth of them relate to the Linz building project, which was always closest to his heart. Equally frequent are sketches for theatres. One morning he surprised me with a neatly drawn design for a commemorative shaft for Munich, which was to be a new symbol of the city, dwarfing the towers of the Frauenkirche. He regarded this project, like the Berlin Triumphal Arch, as his very own, and did not hesitate to make revisions based on his own sketch in the design of a Munich architect. Even today these changes strike me as real improvements, providing better for the transition between the static elements of the base and the dynamic thrust of the column. Hermann Giesler, whom Hitler commissioned to draw up the plans for Munich, could do marvellous imitations of Dr. Lee, the stammering Labour Front leader. Hitler was so delighted with this sort of comedy that he would ask Giesler again and again to tell the story of a visit by the Lees to the showrooms where the models for the Munich city plan were on exhibition. First, Gisela described how the leader of the German workers appeared at the studio in an elegant summer suit with white stitched gloves and a straw hat, accompanied by his wife, who was dressed with equal ostentation. Gisela showed him the Munich plan until Ley interrupted. "I'll build on this entire block. What will that cost? A few hundred millions? Yes, we want to build solidly." "And what will be the purpose of the building?" "A large fashion house. We'll set all the fashions. My wife will take care of that end. We need a whole building for it. My wife and I will set the German fashions. And we'll need whores too, lots of them. A whole house full, with the most modern furnishings. We'll take everything in hand. A few hundred millions for the building, that's nothing." Hitler laughed until the tears came over the depraved notions of his Labour leader. Gisela, who had had to act out this scene innumerable times, was sick to death of it. My own building plans were not the only ones Hitler was energetically promoting. He was constantly approving forums for provincial capitals and urging his corps of leaders to officiate as patrons of public edifices. He liked to see a good deal of ruthless competition, since he assumed that this was the only road to outstanding achievement. This attitude of his often irritated me. He could not understand that there were limits to what we could do. Thus he passed over my objection that before long it would be impossible for me to keep any deadlines because his Gauleiters were using up the available quarry materials for their own buildings. Himmler came to Hitler's aid. When he heard of the threatening shortage of brick and granite, he offered to employ his prisoners to increase production. He proposed to Hitler that an extensive brickworks be set up in Sachsenhausen near Berlin under SS direction and as SS property. Since Himmler was extremely receptive to innovations, someone soon turned up with a new system for manufacturing brick, but the promised production did not follow, for the technique proved a failure. Another promise made by Himmler, who was constantly pursuing futuristic projects, ended similarly. He offered to supply granite blocks for the buildings in Nuremberg and Berlin using the labour of concentration camp prisoners. He immediately started a firm with a non-committal name and set the prisoners to breaking stone. Because of the incredible ignorance of the SS entrepreneurs, the blocks developed cracks, and the SS was finally forced to admit that it could supply only a small part of the promised granite. Dr. Tott's road building organisation took the rest of the material produced and used it for cobblestones. Hitler, who had placed great hopes in Himmler's promises, was more and more annoyed. Finally, he commented sarcastically that the SS had better devote itself to making felt slippers and paper bags, the traditional prison products. Out of the multitude of projects, I myself was to design the square in front of the Great Hall at Hitler's request. In addition, I had taken over Goering's new building and the South Station. That was more than enough, for I was also to design the Nuremberg Party rally buildings. But since these various projects were to be carried out over a decade, I was able to manage if I turned the technical details over to others, with a studio of 8 to 10 associates. It was still possible for me to keep personal control of a group that size. My private office was on Lindenallee in the West End near Adolf Hitler Platz, which had formerly been Reichskanzlerplatz. but my afternoons until the late hours of the evening were regularly reserved for my city planning office in Pariser Platz. Here I assigned major commissions to those men I considered Germany's best architects. Paul Bonatz, after many designs for bridges, was given his first high-rise commission. The High Command of the Navy. Hitler was especially pleased with the grand scale of the design. German Bestelmeyer was assigned the new town hall, Wilhelm Kreis the High Command of the Army, the Soldiers' Hall, and various museums. Peter Behrens, the teacher of Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, who had long worked for the AEG Electrical Company, was entrusted with building the firm's new administrative building on the Grand Boulevard. This naturally called forth objections from Rosenberg and his Cultural Watch and Ward Society. They were outraged that this forerunner of architectural radicalism should be allowed to win immortality on the Führer's Avenue. Hitler, who thought well of Peter Behrens' embassy in Leningrad, built when the city was still St. Petersburg, backed up my decision. Several times I also pressed my teacher, Tessenauer, to take part in the design competitions, but he did not want to abandon his simple, small-town craftsman style and stubbornly resisted the temptation to design big buildings. For sculpture I employed chiefly Joseph Thorek and Amo Brecker, the pupil of Maillol. In 1943, Brecker acted as my intermediary in commissioning a sculpture by Maillol to be set up in Grunwald. Historians have commented that in my private associations I kept away from the party, for example, Treveroper, Fest and Bullock. It might also be said that the party bigwigs kept away from me, whom they regarded as an interloper. But I was not especially interested in what the Reichsleiters and Gauleiters felt, since I had Hitler's confidence. Aside from Karl Henke, who had discovered me, I was not on familiar terms with any of them. None of them visited me at home. Instead, I found my circle of friends among the artists I gave employment to and among their friends. What time I had in Berlin for socializing I spent with Arno Brecker and Wilhelm Kreis. We also frequently saw Wilhelm Kempf, the pianist. In Munich I was on friendly terms with Joseph Thorek and Hermann Kasper, the painter. Late in the night Kasper could seldom be restrained from loudly proclaiming his preference for the Bavarian monarchy. I was also close to my first client, Dr. Robert Frank, for whom I had rebuilt a manor house back in 1933, before I became involved with the buildings for Hitler and Goebbels. It was situated near Wilsnack, some 80 miles from Berlin, and I frequently spent weekends there with my family. Until 1933, Frank had been general manager of the Prussian electricity works, but after the Nazis took power, he was relieved of his post and had since lived in retirement. Occasionally bothered by the party, he was protected by my friendship. In 1945, I entrusted my family to him. There in Schleswig, they were as far as possible from the centre of the collapse. Shortly after my appointment, I managed to persuade Hitler that party members of any quality had long since been assigned leading posts, so that only members of the second rank were available for my tasks. He therefore gave me permission to choose my associates as I pleased. Gradually word went round that a sanctuary for non-party people could be found in my office, and so more and more architects thronged to join us. Once one of my associates asked me for a reference for admission to the party. My answer went the rounds of the Inspectorate General of Building. "Why, it's enough for all of us that am in the party." We took Hitler's building plans seriously, but were not so reverential as others about the solemnity of this Hitlerian Reich. I also continued to absent myself from party meetings, had scarcely any contact with party circles, even in the Berlin district, and neglected the party duties turned over to me, although I could have built them up into positions of power. If only from sheer lack of time, I turned over the beauty of work office to a permanent deputy. I could plead my total incapacity for making public speeches as an excuse for this sort of lack of zeal. In March 1939, I took a trip with a group of close friends through Sicily and southern Italy. Wilhelm Kreis, Joseph Thorak, Hermann Kasper, Amo Brecker, Robert Frank, Karl Brandt and their wives formed the party. Magda Goebbels, the propaganda minister's wife, came along at our invitation. She used a false name for the journey. There were certainly a good many love affairs in Hitler's entourage, and he tolerated them. Thus Bormann, with a crudeness that might be expected from this unfeeling and amoral man, had his movie actress mistress visit him at Obersalzberg and actually stay in his house in the midst of his family. Frau Bormann put up with this situation in a way I found incomprehensible. Goebbels too had many love affairs. Half amused, half revolted, his state secretary Hank would tell how the all-powerful Minister of Culture would blackmail young movie actresses. But Goebbels' intimacy with the Czech film star Lida Barova was more than an affair. At the time his wife broke with him and demanded that he live separately from her and the children. Hank and I were entirely on the wife's side, but Hank himself complicated this marital crisis when he fell in love with his minister's wife, who was so many years his senior. In order to extricate her from this embarrassment, I proposed that she accompany us on the trip. Hank wanted to follow her. During our travels, he bombarded her with love letters, but she was firm in her refusal. Throughout this trip, Frau Goebbels proved a pleasant and sensible woman. In general, the wives of the regime's bigwigs resisted the temptation of power far more than their husbands. They did not lose themselves in the latter's fantasy world. They looked on at the often grotesque antics of their husbands with inner reservations, and were not caught up in the political whirlwind in which their men were carried steeply upward. Somewhat browbeaten, although blindly devoted both to her husband and the party ideology. I had the impression that Frau Goering was inclined to smile at her husband's mania for pomp, and in the final analysis Eva Braun too proved her inner superiority. At any rate, she never used for personal ends the power which lay within her grasp. Sicily, with its Doric temple ruins in Segesta, Syracuse, Selinus and Agrigentum, provided a valuable supplement to the impressions of our earlier journey to Greece. At the site of the temples of Selinus and Agrigentum, I observed once again, and with some satisfaction, that even classical antiquity had not been free of megalomaniacal impulses. The Greeks of the colonies were obviously departing from the principle of moderation so praised in the motherland. Compared to these temples, all the examples of Saracen Norman architecture we encountered paled, except for Frederick II's wonderful hunting castle, the octagonal Castel del Monte. Paestum was another high point of our trip. Pompeii, on the other hand, seemed to me further away from the pure forms of Paestum than were our buildings from the world of the Dorians. On the return journey we stayed in Rome for a few days. The fascist government discovered the real identity of our illustrious travelling companions, and Italian propaganda minister Alfieri invited us all to the opera. but we found it hard to give a plausible explanation for the fact that the second lady of the German Reich was travelling abroad without her husband and therefore set out for home as quickly as possible.
To this day I find it strange that a nation can have so right a sense of what is to come, so much so that all the massive propaganda by the government does not banish this feeling. While we had been dreaming our way through Greek antiquity, Hitler occupied Czechoslovakia and annexed it to the Reich. Back in Germany, we found a general mood of depression. Apprehensions about the future filled all of us. To this day, I find it strange that a nation can have so right a sense of what is to come, so much so that all the massive propaganda by the government does not banish this feeling. Nevertheless, it seemed a better sign that Hitler stood up to Goebbels one day when, at lunch in the Chancellery, the propaganda minister attacked former foreign minister von Neurath, who a few weeks earlier had been appointed Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Goebbels said, "Everyone knows von Neurath is a weak sneak, but what is needed in the Protectorate is a strong hand to keep order. This man has nothing in common with us. He belongs to an entirely different world." Hitler took issue with this. Von Neurath was the only man for the job. In the Anglo-Saxon world, he is considered a man of distinction. The international effect of his appointment will be reassuring, because people will see it in my decision not to deprive the Czechs of their racial and national life. Hitler asked me to report on my impressions of Italy. I had been most struck by the fact that the walls of even the villages were painted with militant propaganda slogans. "We don't need that," Hitler commented. "If it comes to a war, the German people are tough enough. This kind of propaganda may be all right for Italy. Whether it does any good is another question." In his speech to the editors-in-chief of the German press, Hitler described what he considered to be the proper method of propaganda for creating war readiness. Certain events should be presented in such a light that unconsciously the masses will automatically come to the conclusion, if there's no way to redress this matter pleasantly, then it will have to be done by force. We can't possibly let things go on this way. Hitler had already asked me several times to deliver the opening address at the Munich Architectural Exhibition in his stead. Hitherto, I had always been able to avoid such duties by a variety of pretexts. In February 1938, my evasions resulted in a kind of deal. I agreed to design the picture gallery and the stadium for Linz if I did not have to speak. But now, on the eve of Hitler's 50th birthday, a part of the east-west axis in Berlin was to be opened to traffic, with Hitler present at the dedication. That maiden speech could no longer be fended off, and to make matters worse, in the presence of the Chief of State. At dinner, Hitler announced, "A great event! Speer is making a speech. I can hardly wait." In the middle of the roadway at the Brandenburg Gate, the dignitaries of the city had lined up, with me on the right wing and with the crowd massed behind ropes on the distant sidewalks. From the distance came cheers, swelling as Hitler's motorcade approached and becoming a steady roar. Hitler's car stopped right in front of me. He got out and greeted me by shaking hands, while responding to the welcome of the dignitaries merely by raising his arm briefly. Portable movie cameras began filming the scene from close up, while Hitler expectantly took up a position 6 feet away from me. I took a deep breath, then spoke these exact words. Mein Führer, I herewith report the completion of the East-West axis. May the work speak for itself. There was a protracted pause before Hitler replied with a few sentences. Then I was invited into his car and drove with him down the 5-mile lane of Berliners who were paying tribute to him on his 50th birthday. No doubt it had taken an energetic effort by the propaganda ministry to bring this crowd here, but the applause seemed genuine to me. After we had reached the Chancellery and were waiting to be called to dinner, Hitler commented good-humouredly, "You put me in a fine fix with your 2 sentences. I was expecting a long speech, and meant to use the time while you were talking to frame my answer, the way I usually do. But since you finished so quickly, I didn't know what to say. Still, I must grant you that it was a good speech, one of the best I have ever heard." In the following years, this anecdote became part of his regular repertory, and he told it often. At midnight, the diners offered Hitler the proper congratulations, but when I told him that to celebrate the day I had set up a 13-foot model of his triumphal arch in one of the salons, he immediately left the party and hurried to the room. For a long time he stood contemplating, with visible emotion, the dream of his younger years, realized in this model. Overwhelmed, he gave me his hand without a word, and then, in a euphoric mood, lectured his birthday guests on the importance of this structure for the future history of the Reich. That night he returned to look at the model several times. On the way back and forth, we would pass the former cabinet room where Bismarck had presided over the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Here Hitler's birthday presents were heaped up on long tables, pretty much a collection of quiche sent by his Reichsleiters and Gauleiters. White marble nudes, small bronze casts of such well-known works as the Roman boy extracting a thorn from his foot, and oil paintings whose level matched the stuff exhibited in the House of Art. Hitler spoke well of some of the presents, made fun of others, but there was in fact not much difference between them. Meanwhile, matters had progressed between Hank and Frau Goebbels to such a point that, to the horror of everyone in the know, they wished to marry. An ill-matched couple. Hank was young and awkward. She was considerably older and a polished society woman. Hank petitioned Hitler for his approval, but Hitler refused to allow the Goebbels to divorce for a raison d'etat. At the beginning of the 1939 Bayreuth Festival, Hank arrived at my house one morning in a state of despair. Magda and Joseph Goebbels had had a reconciliation, he reported, and gone to Bayreuth together. For my part, I thought this was the happiest outcome for Hank too. But you cannot console a desperate lover with felicitations on his escape. I therefore promised him to find out what had happened in Bayreuth, and left at once. The Wagner family had added a spacious wing to Haus Wanfried, where Hitler and his adjutants stayed during the festival, while Hitler's guests were put up in private homes in Bayreuth. Incidentally, Hitler selected these guests more carefully than he did at Obersalzberg, or even at the Chancellery. Aside from the adjutants, he invited only a few other persons with their wives, those he could be sure would be welcome to the Wagner family. Actually, these guests were almost always only Dr. Dietrich, Dr. Brandt, and myself. On these festival days Hitler seemed more relaxed than usual. He obviously felt at ease in the Wagner family and free of the compulsion to represent power, which he sometimes thought himself obliged to do even within the evening group in the Chancellery. He was gay, paternal to the children, friendly and solicitous toward Winifred Wagner. Without Hitler's financial aid, the festival could scarcely have been kept going. Every year Bormann produced hundreds of thousands of marks from his funds in order to make the festival productions the glory of the German opera season. As patron of the festival, and as the friend of the Wagner family, Hitler was no doubt realizing a dream which even in his youth he perhaps never quite dared to dream. Goebbels and his wife had arrived in Bayreuth on the same day as myself and, like Hitler, had moved into the Wanfried Annex. Frau Goebbels looked very drawn. She spoke quite candidly with me. It was frightful, the way my husband threatened me. I was just beginning to recuperate at Gastein when he turned up at the hotel. For 3 days he argued with me incessantly until I could no longer stand it. He used the children to blackmail me. He threatened to take them away from me. What can I do? The reconciliation is only for show. Albert, it's terrible. I've had to swear never to meet Karl privately again. I'm so unhappy, but I have no choice. What could have been more appropriate for this marital tragedy than, of all operas, Tristan und Isolde? Hitler, Herr and Frau Goebbels, Frau Winifred Wagner and I heard it, sitting in the big central box. Frau Goebbels, on my right, cried silently throughout the performance. During the intermission she sat, bowed and sobbing uncontrollably in a corner of the salon, while Hitler and Goebbels went to the window to show themselves to the audience, both of them strenuously pretending to be unaware of the embarrassing episode. Next morning I was able to explain to Hitler, who could not understand Frau Goebbels' conduct, the background of the so-called reconciliation. As Chief of State, he welcomed this turn of events, but in my presence he sent for Goebbels at once, and in a few dry words informed him that it would be better if he left Bayreuth immediately with his wife. Without allowing him to reply, or even shaking hands with him, he dismissed the propaganda minister and then turned to me. With women, Goebbels is a cynic. He too was one, though in a different way.